They say the worst betrayals happen in silence, but mine happened under crystal chandeliers, in front of hundreds of witnesses, on the day we were supposed to honor my father. My sister claimed my fiancé as if I never existed, and my mother watched without saying a word. So, how did it come to this? My name is Elena. I'm 30 years old, and I run the construction company my father built from the ground up, brick by brick, contract by contract, sacrifice by sacrifice. People often describe me as composed, driven, maybe even a little cold. I've heard it all. But what they don't see is how much of myself I buried just to keep everything standing after my father passed away. Today, I'm going to tell you a story not just about betrayal, but about what happens when the people and how sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one who has already decided how everything will end. It all began on a day that should have been sacred. The air inside the memorial hall was thick with the scent of white lilies, so heavy it almost made it hard to breathe. Rows of polished wooden chairs stretched across the room, filled with Savannah's elite. Men in tailored black suits, women in elegant dresses, their whispers soft and rehearsed, like grief had become a social ritual rather than something real. At the front of the room stood my father's portrait. He looked exactly the way I remembered him, strong, steady, unshakable. The kind of man who didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. The kind of man who built not just a company, but a legacy people believed in. And I was supposed to be the one protecting it. I stood there, dressed in black, hands clasped tightly in front of me, accepting condolences I barely heard. My mind wasn't in the room. It was somewhere else, somewhere quieter, where I could still hear my father's voice telling me that strength wasn't about never falling, it was about knowing when to stand back up. For a moment, I thought I could get through the day without anything breaking. I was wrong, because betrayal doesn't wait for the right time. It chooses the moment when you are the most vulnerable, and then it makes sure everyone is watching. I noticed her before she noticed me. Regina, my older sister. She entered the room like she always did, like she belonged to a different world than the rest of us. Her black dress was flawless, tailored to perfection, every detail calculated. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, but somehow, every step still drew attention. People turned to look at her. They always did. Regina had a way of commanding a room without asking for permission. Growing up, I used to admire that about her. I thought it was confidence. Now, I know better. It was entitlement. She didn't look at me, not once. Instead, her gaze moved across the room until it landed exactly where I feared it would, on Jay, my fiancé. He was standing near the front, speaking with a group of business associates, playing the role of the grieving future son-in-law perfectly. His posture was relaxed, his voice calm, his expression carefully measured. To anyone else, he looked supportive, dependable. To me, he looked like a stranger I was just beginning to understand. Regina walked straight toward him. No hesitation, no pause, no concern for who might be watching. And then she did something that made my entire body go cold. She slipped her arm through his, not casually, not like a sister greeting a future brother-in-law, intimately, possessively. And before I could even process what I was seeing, she rested her head lightly against his shoulder, as if that was where she belonged. As if I didn't exist at all. Time didn't stop. It stretched. Every second became painfully clear, painfully sharp. I waited. I waited for Jay to pull away, to step back, to correct her, to choose me. He didn't. Instead, he leaned slightly toward her, just enough to confirm what my instincts were already screaming. This wasn't new. This wasn't a mistake. This was familiarity, a quiet, practiced kind of closeness that doesn't happen overnight. My fingers tightened around each other, nails pressing into my skin so hard I barely felt it anymore. The noise of the room faded into a dull hum, like I was underwater, watching everything happen from a distance I couldn't close. And then, slowly, I turned my head toward my mother, because no matter how bad something looks, there's always that small part of you that hopes that someone else will see it too, will step in, will tell you that you're not losing your mind. Lydia stood a few steps away, surrounded by a group of women offering their condolences. Her face was calm, too calm. She looked at Regina, at Jay, at the way they stood together like a couple who had nothing to hide. And then she smiled. Not a shocked smile, not an awkward one, a knowing one, a quiet, satisfied smile that felt like the ground beneath my feet had just disappeared. In that moment, something inside me didn't shatter. It settled, because heartbreak is loud. But realization is silent. It slips into your mind and locks everything into place. I understood, all at once, that this wasn't a sudden betrayal. This was something that had been happening behind my back for far longer than I wanted to admit. And I had been the only one who didn't know. Regina finally looked at me then. Her eyes met mine across the room, and slowly, deliberately, her lips curved into a smile that carried no warmth at all. She stepped closer, still holding on to Jay as if she had every right to. When she reached me, the scent of her perfume hit me sharp, overwhelming, suffocating. She leaned in, close enough that no one else could hear her. "You should thank me," she whispered softly, her voice smooth as silk, "for taking care of him when you were too busy playing boss." I didn't respond, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because in that exact moment, I realized something far more important than any argument I could have made. This was what they wanted: a scene, a reaction, a public display where I would lose control, where they could paint me as unstable, emotional, unfit to lead both in my personal life and in the company my father left behind. And suddenly, everything made sense. The timing, the setting, the audience. This wasn't just betrayal, this was strategy. So instead of giving them what they wanted, I did the one thing they would never expect. I smiled, not warmly, not weakly, calmly. Then I stepped back. I turned away from them without another word and walked toward the far side of the room, my heels echoing softly against the floor. Behind me, I could feel their eyes on my back, confused, maybe even a little disappointed, because they thought they had already won. They thought this moment was the end of my story. They were wrong. This was only the beginning. Because what they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that by the time we were all standing in that room, breathing in the scent of lilies and pretending to mourn, I had already seen the truth. And I had already started preparing for the day I would take everything back. So if you're wondering why I didn't scream, why I didn't expose them right then and there, stay with me. Because the real story doesn't start at the moment of betrayal. It starts 3 weeks earlier, when a single transaction on a bank statement whispered the first crack in the illusion I thought was my life. 3 weeks before that memorial, before the lilies and the whispers, and the moment my world shifted under my feet, the truth didn't arrive as a dramatic confession or a careless mistake. It came quietly, in numbers, in a notification most people would have ignored. I was in my office that afternoon, surrounded by contracts, blueprints, and the constant hum of responsibility that had become my life. Running my father's construction company meant I rarely had the luxury of distraction. Every decision mattered. Every dollar had a purpose. And every account was something I monitored with precision. Not because I didn't trust people, but because my father had taught me that trust should never replace awareness. My phone vibrated against the desk. At first, I didn't even look at it. Alerts came in all the time, routine updates, approvals, minor transactions that barely required a second thought. But something about the persistence of the vibration made me pause. I picked it up, glanced at the screen, and felt my focus sharpen instantly. 8,500,000. A single transaction, authorized on a supplementary card issued under my account. Location: a high-end jewelry boutique in downtown Savannah. For a brief second, my mind tried to place it within reason. Business expense, client gift, corporate hospitality. There were dozens of explanations that could have made sense, if not for one detail that refused to be ignored. The store. Velvet, stone. I knew that boutique. They specialized in sharp, modern designs, cold silver, aggressive lines, diamonds that looked more like weapons than ornaments. It wasn't just a style I disliked. It was a style I had never worn. But Regina loved it. My thumb hovered over the screen as a strange, quiet unease began to settle in my chest. Not panic, not anger, just a feeling that something didn't align. Jay had access to that card for business-related expenses only. He knew the boundaries. He knew how I worked. And more importantly, he had never made a purchase of that magnitude without mentioning it to me first. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But doubt, once planted, doesn't stay small. It grows. Before I could even decide whether to call him or wait until evening, my phone rang again. This time, it wasn't a system alert. It was Chloe. My best friend. I answered immediately. But the moment I heard her voice, I knew something was off. She didn't greet me the way she usually did. No teasing, no lightness. Just a low, cautious tone. "Elena, are you busy?" I leaned back in my chair, my eyes drifting toward the window, watching the sunlight reflect off the glass buildings across the street. "I'm always busy," I said lightly. "What's wrong?" There was a pause. The kind of pause that fills the space with something unspoken. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you this," she said finally, her voice dropping even further. "But I just walked past Velvet and Stone, and I saw Jay inside." My grip on the phone tightened slightly. "He was looking at a necklace," she continued. "A diamond choker. I thought maybe he was planning something for you. You know, a surprise or something romantic." For a split second, my heart almost believed that version of the story. Almost. Then she added, "But, Elena, it didn't look like something you'd wear." That was all it took. The unease inside me sharpened into something colder. "What do you mean?" I asked quietly. "It was sharp, silver, kind of bold. Honestly, it reminded me of Regina's style." There it was, the piece that didn't fit. The thread that, once pulled, started unraveling everything. I thanked her calmly, evenly, as if the information hadn't just shifted something fundamental inside me. When the call ended, I placed my phone back on the desk and stared at the numbers again. Velvet, Stone, Jay, Regina. The connection wasn't proven, but it was there. And once you see a pattern, it's impossible to unsee it. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and decisions, but none of it truly registered. My mind kept circling back to the same point, replaying the same possibilities, testing them against everything I thought I knew. By the time I returned home that evening, the air inside the house felt different, heavier, quieter, as if something had already shifted, and I was just arriving late to it. I found Jay in the library, standing near the bar, pouring himself a glass of scotch. He looked relaxed, too relaxed. The kind of ease that comes from someone who believes they are completely in control of the situation. For a moment, I simply watched him. The way he moved, the way he didn't even glance at me immediately, as if my presence was expected, predictable, unthreatening. Then I stepped forward. "Jay," I said, holding up my phone. "Can you explain this?" He turned, his expression barely changing as his eyes flicked toward the screen. If he was surprised, he didn't show it. Instead, he smiled. A small, easy smile that would have reassured me once. "That," he said, taking a sip of his drink, "it's nothing you need to worry about." I didn't lower the phone. $8,500 isn't nothing, I replied. He chuckled softly, as if I were overreacting. "It's an investment," he said smoothly. "There's a small jewelry company tied to that boutique. I thought it would be a good addition to our portfolio. I was planning to tell you once everything was finalized." The explanation was polished. Prepared. Too prepared. I studied his face, searching for something, anything, that felt genuine. "Why didn't you mention it before?" I asked. He stepped closer, closing the distance between us with practiced familiarity. Then he reached out and gently kissed my forehead, the gesture almost tender. "Because you already carry enough," he said. "I wanted to contribute in my own way. Not everything has to be a business discussion, Elena." There it was, again. That subtle shift, turning my concern into something excessive, making my caution feel like a flaw. "Try not to worry so much," he added, his tone soft but condescending in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. You'll drive yourself crazy." Then he walked past me, glass in hand, as if the conversation was over, as if I should be satisfied. I stood there, still holding my phone, listening to the faint echo of his footsteps fading down the hallway. And for the first time, I didn't believe him. Not completely. Not enough. It wasn't just the transaction. It wasn't just Chloe's call. It was the way he answered. Too smooth, too controlled, too quick to dismiss. Like someone who had already rehearsed the lie. That night, I didn't confront him again. I didn't argue. I didn't demand the truth. Because something inside me had shifted in a way I couldn't reverse. I realized I was standing at the edge of something much bigger than a suspicious purchase. And if I stepped forward without understanding it fully, I would lose. So instead, I did something I had never done before in my own relationship. I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Because if there was one thing my father had taught me, it was this. When something doesn't add up, you don't rush to fix it. You step back, you observe, you let the truth reveal itself piece by piece. And as I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet rhythm of a house that no longer felt entirely like mine, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Jay again until I had proof. Real proof. The kind that couldn't be denied, twisted, or explained away. Because if there was betrayal hiding behind that transaction, I wasn't going to expose it with emotion. I was going to dismantle it with precision. And I had no idea yet just how much truth I was about to uncover. If the transaction was the first crack, then what happened 10 days later was the moment the entire structure of my life began to shift. Because suspicion is one thing, but living inside the betrayal, that's something else entirely. It started in the late afternoon, just as I was finishing a long call with one of our contractors. I had barely stepped through the front doors of the estate when I heard unfamiliar movement echoing through the foyer voices, footsteps, the dragging sound of something heavy across marble floors. For a second, I thought I had walked into the wrong house. Then I saw her. Regina stood in the center of the foyer, like she had always belonged there, surrounded by 6 oversized suitcases arranged neatly around her like trophies. She wasn't waiting to be welcomed. She wasn't even pretending to be polite. She was issuing instructions. "Careful with that one," she said sharply to the housekeeper, gesturing toward a designer case. "That bag alone is worth more than your monthly salary." The staff froze for half a second, unsure how to respond. I stood at the top of the stairs, watching everything unfold below me, a strange stillness settling over my body. Regina didn't look up immediately. She didn't acknowledge me, because in her mind, she didn't have to. "I'll take the guest suite," she continued, already moving toward the hallway, as if the decision had been made long before I walked through the door. "Make sure the bath is prepared. I've had a stressful day." Only then did she glance up. Our eyes met, and slowly, she smiled. Not warmly, not apologetically, but with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly how far she could push and expected no resistance. "Elena," she said casually, as if she had just dropped by for tea. "You're home." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to make the air shift. "What are you doing here?" I asked finally, my voice calm, controlled. She sighed, as if I had asked an unreasonable question. "My apartment is under emergency renovation," she replied, brushing an invisible speck of dust off her sleeve. "Water damage. It's a complete disaster. I'll be staying here for a while." A while, not a request. A declaration. Before I could say anything else, another voice entered the conversation. "Isn't it wonderful?" my mother said, stepping into the foyer with a brightness that didn't belong in the situation. "It's been so long since we've all been under the same roof." I turned toward her slowly. Lydia looked pleased, not concerned about the sudden intrusion, not curious about whether I was comfortable with the arrangement, just pleased, as if this was something she had been expecting, or worse, something she had already agreed to. "She needs support right now," my mother continued, placing a gentle hand on Regina's arm. "You know how sensitive she is." Sensitive. The word echoed in my mind, hollow and misplaced. Regina, who had just insulted the staff without hesitation, who had taken over my home without asking, was being described as fragile. I felt something tighten in my chest. "And you'll make sure she's taken care of, won't you?" Lydia added, turning her gaze to me. "Shopping, expenses, anything she needs. It's the least we can do as family." There it was, not just an invasion of space, an expectation of obedience. I opened my mouth to respond, to question, to push back, but I stopped myself. Because in that moment, something clicked into place. This wasn't spontaneous. This was coordinated. Regina didn't arrive alone. She arrived with permission. And that meant confronting them now would lead nowhere except exactly where they wanted me. Frustrated, emotional, painted as unreasonable. So instead, I nodded. "Of course," I said quietly. Regina's smile deepened. She had expected resistance, and my lack of it only made her more comfortable. That night, the house no longer felt like mine. It felt like something I was being slowly pushed out of room by room, decision by decision. Over the next few days, Regina's presence spread through the estate like a slow-moving storm. She didn't stay confined to the guest suite. She occupied every space she found interesting. The sitting room became hers in the afternoons. The dining area turned into her stage in the evenings. Her perfume lingered in the air long after she left a room, sharp and overwhelming, like a reminder that she had been there first. And Jay adapted too easily. He laughed at her jokes. He stayed a little too long in conversations with her. He didn't avoid her. If anything, he gravitated toward her. The unease inside me didn't disappear. It deepened. The breaking point came during a formal dinner my mother insisted on hosting, a celebration, she called it, of family unity. I knew better. It wasn't about unity. It was about positioning. I took my seat at the table, my posture straight, my expression composed. Across from me, Regina entered last, ensuring all eyes would land on her the moment she appeared. And they did. Because around her neck was the necklace, the exact one from velvet and stone. The jagged silver design caught the chandelier light, reflecting it in sharp, deliberate angles that made it impossible to ignore. My stomach dropped, but my face didn't change. Regina noticed. Of course she did. She leaned back slightly, letting the diamonds catch the light even more, then smiled at me with slow, deliberate precision. "This suits me better than it ever would you," she said, her tone light but her words cutting. "Some things just don't belong to people who are too practical." The table went quiet. Jay let out a small laugh, not loud enough to draw attention, just enough to show where he stood. I gripped my fork, the metal pressing into my fingers, grounding me in the moment. Because her words weren't just about the necklace. They were about identity, about reducing me to something less feminine, less desirable, less worthy. And Jay said nothing. The rest of the dinner unfolded like a performance I couldn't escape. Regina reached across the table to feed him a bite from her plate, laughing about old times they had shared before I was in the picture. Jay didn't stop her. He didn't correct her. He participated. By the time the meal ended, the evidence wasn't subtle anymore. It was undeniable. But the night wasn't over. Before I could retreat, my mother called for a family meeting in the parlor. Regina was already seated when I entered, casually filing her nails, completely at ease. Jay leaned back in his chair, arms relaxed, like he was waiting for something. And then Lydia spoke. Her tone was calm, prepared. "We need to discuss the future," she said. "Specifically, the upcoming memorial and the company." I remained silent, listening. "Jay needs full administrative access to your father's trust," she continued. "It's time he steps into his role properly." There it was. The real objective, not just emotional manipulation. Control. I met her gaze steadily. "That's not possible," I said. "There are legal protocols." "You're being selfish," Lydia cut in sharply. The word landed harder this time. "He's your fiancé," she continued. "If you don't trust him with this, how do you expect him to stand beside you as an equal?" I glanced at Regina. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The slight nod of her head was enough. They were aligned. Every move, every word. Planned. I inhaled slowly, forcing my voice to remain even. I'll consult with the legal team, I said. It wasn't agreement, but it wasn't refusal either. It bought me time, and time, I was beginning to understand, was the only advantage I had left. That night, as I walked past my father's study, something caught my attention. A thin line of light under the door. I paused, then pushed it open quietly. Jay was inside, standing at my father's desk, searching. He turned quickly when he heard me, his expression shifting for just a fraction of a second before settling back into that familiar, composed calm. "What are you doing?" I asked. "Helping you," he replied smoothly. "Looking for documents for the ceremony." The lie was effortless. Too effortless. I stepped further into the room, my gaze moving from him to the open drawers, the disturbed papers. "You shouldn't be in here without asking," I said. He smiled faintly. "Why are you always so suspicious?" he replied. "I'm on your side, Elena." "On my side." The words felt empty, because as he walked past me and into the hallway, I saw Regina standing there in the shadows, waiting, and the look they exchanged. It said everything they didn't need to say out loud. I stood alone in that room long after they disappeared, the silence pressing in around me, and for the first time, the truth wasn't something I suspected anymore. It was something I understood. Regina wasn't just interfering in my life. She was orchestrating it, and Jay was following her lead. That realization didn't make me angry. Not immediately. It made me focused. Because if they were playing a game, then I needed to stop reacting to their moves and start planning my own. And from that moment on, I wasn't the woman they thought I was anymore. The moment I stopped reacting, everything became clearer. Not easier, but clearer. Because once you accept that the people around you are no longer on your side, you stop looking for reassurance and you start looking for evidence. 1 week before the memorial, I drove to see the only person who had never once betrayed my father's trust. Julian, our family attorney. His office was exactly the way I remembered it, quiet, structured, almost clinical in its precision. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined with legal volumes, a large oak desk placed perfectly at the center. Everything in its place, everything intentional. It was the opposite of the chaos I had been living in, and for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I laid everything out: bank statements, transaction records, internal account summaries, access logs, every detail I had quietly gathered over the past days, every number that didn't add up, every movement of money that felt wrong. Julian didn't interrupt. He didn't ask questions immediately. He simply read. The longer he looked, the colder his expression became. Not surprised, not confused, but something far more unsettling. Certain. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that made my chest tighten. "This isn't mismanagement," he said. "This is deliberate." The word landed heavier than I expected. Deliberate. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A decision. He pointed to a series of withdrawals I hadn't fully connected before, amounts that seemed small on their own but formed a clear pattern when viewed together. Funds pulled from operational accounts. Transfers routed through intermediary accounts. Purchases disguised as business expenses. And then he showed me the worst part. Signatures. My signature. Or at least, something that was meant to look like it. "They're forged," Julian said flatly, "and not particularly well if you know what to look for." I stared at the documents, a strange numbness settling over me. I should have felt shocked, angry, devastated. But instead, I felt something colder. Clarity, because now there was no more doubt. Jay wasn't just betraying me emotionally. He was stealing from the company my father built. And Regina wasn't just involved. She was benefiting. Every luxury purchase, every sudden display of wealth, every careless, arrogant demand she made since moving into my home, it all aligned perfectly with the timeline of those withdrawals. They weren't just taking from me. They were feeding off everything my father had left behind. I leaned back in my chair, my fingers laced together tightly. "What do we do?" I asked quietly. Julian didn't hesitate. We don't confront them. I looked up at him. That's it, I said. We just wait? If you confront them now, he continued calmly, they'll deny everything. They'll destroy whatever evidence they can. And more importantly, they'll control the narrative. He paused, letting that settle. Your sister will play the victim. Your mother will support her. And Jay? He exhaled softly. Jay will make you look unstable. I didn't argue, because deep down, I knew he was right. So what's the alternative? I asked. Julian's gaze sharpened slightly. We document everything, he said, legally, thoroughly, and we let them expose themselves. That was the moment everything shifted from survival to strategy. I returned home later that afternoon with a plan that felt both necessary and deeply uncomfortable, because the next step required something I never thought I would have to do in my own home. We brought in a licensed security consulting team quietly, professionally, under Julian's guidance. Everything was documented, authorized, and within legal boundaries. No shortcuts, no risks that could compromise the case. Their job wasn't to invade privacy for the sake of curiosity. It was to protect assets, to document potential fraud, to preserve evidence. Still, the feeling of watching my own house transform into a monitored space was unsettling. It didn't feel like justice. Not yet. It felt like war. Within 48 hours, the truth I had been preparing myself for became undeniable. I sat alone in my bedroom, the soft glow of my laptop illuminating the dark as I reviewed the footage. The private sitting room, the one place in the house that used to feel quiet, safe, now it felt like a stage. Jay and Regina sat close together on the velvet sofa, a bottle of wine open between them. She leaned into him effortlessly, her fingers tracing along his jaw in a way that was far too familiar to be hidden behind excuses. They weren't careful. They didn't need to be, because in their minds, they had already won. Just a few more days, Jay said, his voice low but confident. Once she signs everything, I'll take control. She won't even see it coming. Regina laughed, a soft, satisfied sound that made something inside me go completely still. She won't fight back, she replied. She never does. I closed my eyes briefly, not to block it out, but to steady myself, because this wasn't the moment to break. This was the moment to remember, to record, to use. The next clip was worse. The following morning, my mother joined Regina in the same room. They sat together, sipping tea like this was just another ordinary day, another ordinary conversation. Lydia leaned slightly closer, her voice calm, almost instructional. You need to be patient, she said. Men like him need to feel in control. Let him think it's his idea. Regina nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. He's already there, she replied. He'll do whatever I want. Then she added, with a casual cruelty that felt almost effortless. Elena is just convenient. Convenient. Not a daughter. Not a sister. Not even a person. Just a resource. Something to be used until it wasn't needed anymore. I stared at the screen long after the footage ended, the silence in my room pressing down on me. And that was the moment it became real in a way it hadn't before. Not just the betrayal, but the extent of it. This wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was calculated, structured, planned, and for the first time since all of this began, I felt something shift inside me that wasn't grief. It wasn't even anger. It was resolve. I picked up my phone and called Julian. I've seen enough, I said. There was a brief pause on the other end. Good, he replied calmly. Then we moved to the next phase. What does that look like? I asked. It looks like patience, he said, and precision. He explained the final part of the plan, how we would allow Jay to believe he had succeeded, how we would give him just enough confidence to act openly, to confirm everything we needed in a setting where he couldn't deny it. A public setting, a stage, the memorial. At first, the idea made my stomach twist. It felt harsh. Exposing everything like that, in front of people who had come to mourn my father. But then I thought about Regina's words. Convenient. I thought about my mother's silence, Jay's lies, the money they had taken, the future they were planning to steal. And I realized something important. This wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. And truth doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it has to be undeniable. I understand, I said finally. Good, Julian replied. Then from this point forward, you don't react. You don't argue. You don't confront. You let them believe they've already won. I ended the call and sat there for a long time, the weight of what was coming settling over me, because the hardest part wasn't gathering evidence. It wasn't proving what they had done. It was what came next, pretending I didn't know. Living in the same house, sitting at the same table, looking at people who were actively trying to destroy me and acting like everything was normal. But I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If I wanted to end this completely, I couldn't afford to lose control now. So I took a breath, closed the laptop, and prepared myself for the role I would have to play, because the final act of their plan was about to begin. And this time, I would be the one writing the ending. The last 3 days before the memorial felt like living inside a carefully staged illusion. Every word I spoke, every expression I allowed myself to show, it was all measured, controlled, intentional, because by that point, I understood something that changed the way I moved through my own life. The more convinced they were of my weakness, the less careful they became. And I needed them careless. On Thursday morning, I walked into my father's study and found Jay exactly where I expected him to be, seated behind the desk, flipping through documents he had no right to touch, as if he were already preparing himself for a role he hadn't earned. For a moment, I stood in the doorway and simply watched him. This man, the one I had planned to marry, looked completely at ease in a space that had once been sacred to me. There was no hesitation in his movements, no trace of guilt, just quiet confidence, the kind that comes from believing the outcome is already decided. I stepped forward, my heels soft against the wooden floor, and placed a thick folder on the desk in front of him. He looked up, slightly surprised. "What's this?" he asked. I lowered my gaze, allowing my shoulders to relax just enough to suggest exhaustion, not too dramatic, just believable. "I've been thinking," I said quietly, "about everything you said." He leaned back in his chair, studying me more carefully now. "And?" he prompted. I took a slow breath, as if the words were difficult to say. "You were right," I continued. "I've been holding on too tightly, trying to control everything instead of trusting you." The shift in his expression was subtle, but unmistakable. Suspicion flickered for a second. Then it disappeared, replaced by something else. Satisfaction. "I'm tired, Jay," I added softly. "I don't want to keep fighting. I want us to move forward, together." Silence filled the space between us for a brief moment. Then he reached for the folder. "What exactly are you proposing?" he asked. "Authorization," I replied. "Limited access. Enough for you to take a more active role, to prove to everyone that we're partners." The documents inside had been prepared carefully, under Julian's supervision, structured in a way that appeared legitimate, but ultimately ensured that any misuse would be traceable, undeniable. Jay didn't know that. He only saw opportunity. He flipped through the pages quickly, not reading deeply, not questioning the details. Because greed has a way of blinding people to risk. "You're sure about this?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer he wanted. I nodded. "I trust you." The lie came easier than I expected. He smiled. A real smile this time, not the practiced one he used in public, but something sharper, more revealing. And then he signed. Just like that. No hesitation. No second thought. The sound of the pen against paper was quiet, almost insignificant. But to me, it sounded like a door closing. "Thank you," he said, sliding the folder back toward me. "You won't regret this." I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, then gave a small nod. "I know, but what I meant was something entirely different. Because at that moment, I wasn't giving him power. I was giving him enough rope to expose himself completely." As I left the study, I didn't look back. But I could already feel the shift, the subtle change in the air, the beginning of their downfall. It didn't take long. Within hours, the house felt different. Regina no longer pretended to be polite. There was no effort to hide her behavior, no attempt to maintain the illusion of respect. She moved through the house with open entitlement, speaking more freely, laughing louder, making plans that assumed control over everything around her. At lunch, she sat at the head of the table, not across from me, not beside me, at the head, as if the position had already been reassigned. "We should start planning a trip," she said casually, scrolling through her phone. "Somewhere far. Maldives, maybe. We deserve a break after everything settles." Jay smirked slightly, glancing at her. "Agreed," he replied. "We'll have more than enough resources soon." They didn't lower their voices. They didn't need to. In their minds, I was no longer a factor, just an obstacle that had already been removed. I sat there, listening, my expression neutral, my posture composed. Inside, everything was sharp, clear, because every word they spoke now was no longer speculation. It was confirmation. Later that afternoon, I took the next step, the one I had planned carefully. I went to Regina's room. She was lounging on the bed when I knocked, flipping through a magazine like she had nothing else to concern herself with. She didn't look up immediately. "Come in," she said lazily. I stepped inside, holding a garment bag in my hand. "I brought you something," I said. That got her attention. She sat up slightly, curiosity flickering in her eyes. "What is it?" she asked. I unzipped the bag slowly and revealed the dress. Scarlet silk. Bold, striking, impossible to ignore. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she stood, walking toward me, her gaze fixed on the fabric. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "I thought it would suit you," I said calmly. "For the memorial." That made her pause. "Red?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "It represents strength," I replied smoothly. "Confidence. You stand out. You shouldn't hide that." I watched her carefully as she considered it, because I knew exactly what she was thinking. Regina didn't see rules. She saw opportunities to dominate attention, and this was irresistible. A slow smile spread across her face. "You're finally starting to understand," she said, taking the dress from my hands. I was beginning to think you never would. There was no gratitude in her tone, only approval, as if I had just proven myself worthy of her standards. I let her believe that, because the truth was, that dress wasn't a gift. It was a spotlight, one she would willingly step into. And once she did, there would be nowhere left to hide. That night, the house was quiet, too quiet. I waited until everything had settled before leaving my room and making my way toward the ballroom where the memorial would be held. The audiovisual team was already there, running final checks, preparing the tribute presentation that was supposed to honor my father. I approached them calmly, the USB drive in my hand feeling heavier than it should have. "I need to update the presentation," I said. There were questions, of course, but everything had already been arranged through Julian permissions, instructions, clear direction. No confusion, no hesitation. The file was uploaded, replaced, secured. As I walked out of the ballroom, I felt a strange sense of stillness settle over me. Not relief, not yet, just certainty. On my way back, I passed the balcony. Jay's voice stopped me. He was outside, speaking into his phone, his tone low, but filled with something unmistakable. Confidence. "Everything's set," he said. She signed. "Tomorrow after the speech, it's done." A pause. Then, a quiet laugh. "Yeah, we're about to have everything." I didn't move. I didn't react. I just stood there in the shadows, listening. Because this was the final confirmation, not just of what they had done, but of what they believed. They thought the story was over. They thought they had already won. I turned away silently and walked back to my room, closing the door behind me with steady hands. And, for the first time since all of this began, I allowed myself to feel something close to anticipation. Not for revenge, but for truth, because in less than 24 hours, everything they had built on lies would collapse, and they would have no one left to blame but themselves. I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, the events of the past weeks replaying in my mind, not as pain, but as pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. Every word, every action, every betrayal, it had all led to this moment. And tomorrow, when the room filled with people, with expectations, with carefully constructed illusions, I would be ready. Not to fight, not to argue, but to reveal. And once the truth was out, there would be no going back. The morning of the memorial arrived with a strange kind of stillness, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something it couldn't yet see. Savannah's heat wrapped around the estate like a heavy curtain, but inside the grand ballroom, everything felt cold, controlled, perfectly arranged. Rows of black chairs filled the space, the soft murmur of voices weaving through the air as guests arrived one by one, business partners, city officials, old family friends, people who had known my father long enough to understand what his name meant. I stood near the side of the room, dressed in black, composed in a way that felt almost unnatural. My reflection in the tall glass panels beside me looked calm, steady, unshaken. But that wasn't who I had been just weeks ago. That was who I had become. Jay moved through the crowd like he belonged at the center of it. His posture was confident, his expression measured, his voice carrying just enough weight to make people listen. He accepted condolences with practiced grace, shaking hands, nodding respectfully, offering carefully chosen words that made him appear like the natural successor to everything my father had built. To anyone watching, he looked like the future, and that was exactly what he believed. Then Regina arrived. Even before I saw her, I felt the shift. The subtle pause in conversation. The way attention redirected itself without being asked. And when I turned, there she was, wearing the scarlet silk dress. It cut through the room like a streak of fire against a sea of black, bold, inappropriate, impossible to ignore. Every eye followed her as she walked forward, her expression calm, confident, completely unaware of how she truly looked in that moment, not powerful, not admired, but exposed. Regina mistook their stares for admiration. She always did. She moved toward Jay without hesitation, sliding her arm through his again, leaning into him with that same practiced intimacy. Her head rested lightly against his shoulder, her smile subtle, satisfied, as if she had already claimed everything she wanted. And this time, I didn't look away. I didn't feel the same sharp pain I had felt before, because now I understood what I was looking at. Not love, not even betrayal anymore, just arrogance. The kind that blinds people right before everything falls apart. Jay gently stepped forward, easing himself away from Regina, not out of discomfort, but because it was time for his moment. He adjusted his jacket, walked toward the podium, and took his place as if he had already been chosen. The room quieted. All attention shifted to him. And for a moment, everything followed the script he believed in. He began his speech smoothly, his voice steady, filled with carefully crafted emotion. He spoke about legacy, about responsibility, about my father's vision. He painted himself as the one who would carry it forward, the one who understood what needed to be done. And then, he said it, "My father-in-law believed in strong leadership," Jay said, placing a hand over his chest. "And today, I'm honored to step forward, to take on that responsibility in Elena's place." The words hung in the air. A ripple of confusion moved through the audience, subtle, restrained, but present. Some of my father's closest associates exchanged glances. They weren't applauding, not yet. Because something didn't feel right. That was when I moved. I stepped out from where I had been standing and walked toward the stage, my heels echoing softly against the polished floor. The sound carried further than I expected, cutting through the silence in a way that made people turn. Jay noticed. Of course he did. A flicker of irritation crossed his face, brief, controlled, but unmistakable. I wasn't part of his plan anymore, but he stepped aside slightly, expecting me to follow the script he had written for me. To concede, to support him, to disappear gracefully. I reached the podium and placed my hand lightly against the microphone. "Wait," I said. The single word was enough to stop everything. Jay's smile tightened. Elena, he said quietly, his tone warning without being obvious. Now isn't the time. I think, I interrupted calmly, my voice steady, carrying across the room, that before anyone takes on that responsibility, there's something you all deserve to see. The room shifted. Curiosity replaced confusion. I turned slightly, my gaze lifting toward the control booth, and gave a small, deliberate nod. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then the screen behind us flickered to life. At first, people expected the memorial tribute, the photos, the memories, the carefully edited video honoring my father's life. That's what Jay expected too. But instead, the footage appeared. Clear, undeniable. Regina and Jay in the private sitting room laughing, drinking, speaking openly about plans that had nothing to do with family or legacy. Her voice echoed through the speakers, calling me convenient. His followed, outlining exactly how he intended to take control once I signed the authorization. Gasps spread through the room like a wave. The silence that followed was heavier than anything I had ever felt. Then the screen shifted. Financial records. Transaction logs. Each one aligned with the timeline of their actions. Each one connecting the dots between his access and the money that had been quietly disappearing. I didn't need to say anything. The truth was speaking for itself. Jay turned pale. For the first time since I had known him, he looked uncertain, then angry. "This is ridiculous," he snapped, stepping toward me. "Turn it off. Elena, what are you doing? This is fake. Fake." The word sounded hollow, because even he didn't believe it. He reached toward the laptop on the podium, but before he could touch it, security stepped in, professional, controlled, exactly where they needed to be. "This is defamation," he continued, his voice rising now, losing the smooth control he had relied on. "You're trying to destroy me." "No," I said quietly, meeting his gaze. "I'm just showing everyone who you really are." The room was no longer silent. Whispers spread quickly now, conversations breaking out in hushed tones, people leaning toward each other, processing what they had just seen. Regina hadn't moved. She was still standing near the front, her expression frozen, her scarlet dress suddenly no longer a symbol of power, but a spotlight she couldn't escape. "Jay," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "do something." He didn't look at her, not the way he had before. Because the moment pressure replaced illusion, everything changed. And then it was over. Law enforcement stepped forward, calm but firm, their presence cutting through the chaos with authority. The charges were stated clearly: financial misconduct, fraud, words that carried weight, that couldn't be brushed aside with charm or excuses. Jay struggled, not gracefully, not convincingly, but desperately, and that was the moment everyone understood. Not just what he had done, but who he really was. Regina rushed toward him, reaching out, trying to hold on to something that was already gone. He pushed her away, hard enough to make her stumble. "Stay out of this," he snapped, his voice filled with frustration, not loyalty. She fell, right there, in the middle of the room, the scarlet silk pooling around her like a stain she couldn't wash away. For a second, no one moved. Then she turned toward my mother. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, "do something." Lydia stood frozen, not composed, not in control, just still. Because for the first time, there was nothing she could say that would fix this. No narrative she could twist, no excuse she could offer. The truth had already taken its place. I stepped forward slowly, my presence grounding the moment again. "Before anyone leaves," I said, my voice calm, "there's one more thing." Julian moved beside me, holding a document I knew well. My father's will. He explained it clearly, professionally, without emotion. The clause. The one my father had insisted on years ago. A condition tied to integrity, to conduct, to the preservation of the family's name. Regina's actions, my mother's involvement, they had consequences, real ones, immediate ones. And as the weight of those words settled over the room, I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt light, as if something that had been pressing down on me for weeks, months, had finally lifted. I looked at them, at Jay, at Regina, at Lydia, and for the first time, I didn't see power. I didn't see control. I saw exactly what they had always been. People who thought they could take everything without ever being held accountable. I stepped back, allowing the moment to close on its own, because there was nothing left to say. The truth had already done all the work, and as they were led away one by one, their voices fading, their presence shrinking, I stood there in the silence that followed, not as someone who had been betrayed, but as someone who had finally taken everything back. Stories like this aren't really about revenge, they're about awakening, about that quiet moment when you finally see people for who they truly are, not who you hoped they could be. Elena didn't win because she was louder, harsher, or more ruthless. She won because she chose clarity over denial, patience over impulse, and truth over comfort. And that's something many of us struggle with, especially when betrayal comes from the people we call family. What makes this story powerful isn't just the dramatic ending in that ballroom. It's the journey before it, the silence, the observation, the strength it takes to hold everything together while preparing to let it all go. Because sometimes protecting yourself means letting go of relationships you once thought were unbreakable. So I want to ask you, if you were in her place, would you have done the same? Or would you have chosen a quieter ending? If this story resonated with you, if it made you feel something real, then don't forget to subscribe to Revenge Tale Society. Here, we don't just tell stories, we explore the truth behind them, the emotions, the choices, and the consequences. Stay with us for more journeys like this. And until next time, take care of your heart and never ignore what it's trying to tell you.